Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Everybody Had a Notion, Music and Mayhem in 1960s Los Angeles, by William Mckeen, narrated by Johnny Heller. Author's Note. I was sitting on the spare bed in Dennis Wilson's hotel suite. We had a few more minutes before the Beach Boys would take the stage at Cincinnati's Riverfront Coliseum. I was on a magazine assignment and had spent most of the day interviewing Carl Wilson and Alan Jardine and having dinner with Mike Love. Dennis didn't want an interview. He invited me to his room to drink a beer, watch television, and bullshit before the concert. I asked about his old roommate, Charles Manson. "Some things," he said, "I don't talk about." He didn't throw me out or berate me for asking about his friend, the mass murderer. Instead, he offered me a ride to the show in his limousine. When we got to the Coliseum, where a couple of years later 11 fans would be trampled to death at a concert by The Who, we got out at the stage door. Inside the hall, he shook hands and clutched my shoulder, then walked up the riser to his drum kit. I'll never forget the crowd's thunder as he took the stage. That was as close as I'll ever get to being a rock star. I talked to Dennis several times in those years, but never got out the Manson question before he'd cut me off. I was persistent because I wanted to know what it was like to wake on that morning when everybody finally knew about Manson and connected him with the Tate and LaBianca murders. Imagine one of your best friends lived in that house on Cielo Drive. You'd been there for parties. You'd sip vodka in that living room where Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring were butchered. You'd played football on the lawn where Abigail Folger was killed, stabbed 28 times. And you knew this guy, the man responsible. When you couldn't turn him into the rock star he so desperately wanted to be, he threatened to kidnap your 5-year-old son. He left a bullet with a friend of yours and said, "Tell Dennis there's more where that came from." So what was it like, Dennis? How did it feel that morning when you woke up and Manson was in all the papers? We'll never know. Long before reality television shows made hoarders into celebrities, I'd begun stockpiling stories about the artists in that time and place. Los Angeles rock and roll in the 60s. Some of the most joyous music of my life was made there and then, but the trajectory of that decade led to a season of dread. Over the years, interviewing other artists from that era, I'd always have to ask a Manson question. Few wanted to talk about it. Bad vibrations, they said. When I was diagnosed with cancer, I figured it was time to finally do this book, which I'd been thinking about for years. My illness rendered me sedentary, but I still wanted to tell the story, not knowing if I'd ever have another chance. Carl and Dennis Wilson are gone, as are so many others I'd interviewed, as well as others gone before I could speak to them. I've done my best to tell their stories. William Mckeen, Boston, Massachusetts. Introduction. Brothers. From the world of darkness I did loose demons and devils and the power of scorpions to torment. Charles Manson. It was there in his face, loss and doubt behind hollow eyes. Once he'd been unstoppable, one of the most successful young men of his generation. He was the reclusive king of California rock and roll, ruling from the background as the music industry was transformed around him and, in some ways, because of him. But at the key moment, when the whole world was watching, he abdicated and withdrew into his cocoon. That was last year. Now it had reached the point where Brian couldn't let go of anything. He was intimidated, gun-shy, pathologically apprehensive, and much too afraid to let his songs out into the world where they would be played and heard and judged by others. No matter how great the songs, no matter how much everyone told him he was a genius, Brian Wilson was afraid of the criticism that came after he shared the music in his soul. So he kept adding superfluous fractions of melody to the recordings until he worked the musicians, and especially his brothers, up to a plateau of exhaustion and impatience. As long as we are all working, he thought, then we never have to finish. Thus was the state of Brian's mental illness in the spring of 1968. Difficult as it was now, in the middle of the night, and bleary at the end of a long recording session, Dennis Wilson still couldn't help but admire his big brother. At that point in their history, the Wilson brothers, including younger brother Carl, had spent 5 golden years as America's preeminent rock and roll band, the Beach Boys. They'd begun recording in 1961 when Carl was just 15. Brian, 19 then, was responsible for writing, producing, and arranging all of the group's recordings. It was a lot of responsibility for a guy not yet old enough to vote. The Wilson brothers came from modest beginnings in Hawthorne, California, cheek by jowl with Los Angeles, but, as they bragged in one of their hit songs, they'd been all around this great big world. Not bad for 5 boys from the suburbs. Most rock and roll artists up to that point had been subject to the whims of Svengali-like record producers or music business executives, serving as masterminds behind the scenes, telling the young artists what to record, how to record it, and what musicians to use on the recording. The Beach Boys were among the first to have its Svengali as a member of the band. Dennis once said of his older brother, "Brian Wilson is the Beach Boys. He is the band. We're his fucking messengers. He's all of it, period. We're nothing. He's everything." Brian's messages had sold millions of copies and made the Beach Boys famous. But now detractors were stepping forward to knock the great Brian Wilson off his pedestal. All evening and into the cracks of morning, Dennis had watched Brian in his home studio go through more than 20 takes of a new song called, for the moment, Even Steven. Instruments had been recorded the week before, and the track had a vague sort of bossa nova sound that would have been hot stuff 10 years ago, but that seemed monstrously out of place in the uber-hip late spring of 1968. The lyrical highlight of Even Steven was the verse in which Brian Wilson, famous American rock star, gave listeners directions to his house. In another verse, he sang of sharpening a pencil. Dennis didn't agree with it, but he understood where the criticism was coming from. The year before, after months of build-up in the press, Brian had decided not to release the experimental album he'd written and recorded for the group. Smile was full of odd and delightful musical ideas, but Brian began tinkering incessantly. He was afraid to let go of the tracks, to share the music with the world. Brian had become monumentally nervous. When he was 19 and 20, churning out the band's hits about surfing and hot rods, Brian was invincible. The hits kept on coming. I Get Around, Fun, 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 California Girls, and a dozen others. He'd capped off that era in 1966 with the Pet Sounds album, a relatively somber meditation on lost love and aging, and then tied everything up with Good Vibrations, a #1 record that seemed at once as sweet and innocent as anything else in the Beach Boys' candy-striped all-American canon, and at the same time, very hip. Good Vibrations was also when the not letting go began to be a problem. It took him 6 months and 3 recording studios to finish the record, and at the end of all that frustrating studio time, the finished record didn't sound that much different from the first take. Good Vibrations was such a wondrous, worldwide success that expectations were high for what was to be the follow-up album, a work to be called Smile. Brian referred to it as his teenage symphony to God. Magazine writers and admiring musicians made the pilgrimage to Brian's home or to Western Recorder's studio to see where the world of music was going next. New York Philharmonic maestro Leonard Bernstein put Brian on one of his television specials. Brian sat alone at a piano, playing an oblique, severely intellectual song called Surf's Up, which of course had nothing to do with surfing. A blind class aristocracy, back through the opera glass, you see. The pit and the pendulum drawn, columnated ruins domino. But then, nothing. Brian couldn't or wouldn't finish Smile, so the other members of the group intervened to produce an album, long overdue under their contract with Capitol Records, made out of salvaged fragments and quickly recorded and innocuous ditties. Smiley Smile was lightweight, a bunt instead of a grand slam, as Carl Wilson so eloquently put it. Significantly, the credit produced by Brian Wilson was replaced with produced by the Beach Boys. In the dragging months he had tinkered with the album under relentless media scrutiny, Brian had been passed by. Before he could finish Smile to his satisfaction, his cross-Atlantic rivals, the Beatles, had released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The world anointed the British group as the undisputed heavyweight champs, and the world soon forgot Brian Wilson. The Smiley Smile release was another nail in the coffin of Brian Wilson, musical visionary. He's a fool, critics said, thinking he can compete with the Beatles. Despite his gentle exterior, Brian was enormously competitive, and the criticism stung. What hurt worse was that some of the criticism came from within his group. His older cousin, Mike Love, was lead singer and often the lyricist for Brian's lavish melodies. Mike liked
Sample complete. Ready to continue?